They say money talks, but in the Sterling family, it didn't just talk, it screamed. When Alexander picked up that pen, her hands trembling, her husband Marcus didn't just smile, he laughed. It was a cruel, gut-wrenching sound that echoed off the mahogany walls, promising her a future of poverty while he sat on a throne of gold. He thought he had won. He thought she was weak. But neither of them knew that a dead man had been watching from the grave. That signature didn't destroy Alexander's life. It destroyed his. Stick around, because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a brutal lesson in karma that you won't believe until the very last second. The air in the conference room was so cold, it felt less like a law office and more like a morgue. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 45th floor of the Sterling Tower in downtown Chicago, blurring the city lights into streaks of gray and charcoal. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic tapping of a platinum fountain pen against a polished oak table. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of the table, checking his Rolex Daytona for the third time in a minute. He didn't look at his wife, or rather, the woman who would cease to be his wife in approximately 5 minutes. He looked through her. "Come on, Alexander." Marcus sighed, his voice dripping with that aristocratic boredom he had perfected over 30 years of unchecked privilege. It's a standard post-nuptial release. You sign, you leave, and you never have to pretend you belong in this world again. Isn't that what you wanted? Freedom? Alexander Vance, soon to just be Alexander Vance again, stared at the document in front of her. The paper was thick, creamy, and expensive. It was titled Voluntary Relinquishment of Marital Assets and Spousal Support. Beside her, her own lawyer, a court-appointed man named Mr. Henderson, who wore a suit 2 sizes too big, looked nervous. "Mrs. Sterling," Henderson whispered, "I must advise you again. If you sign this, you leave with nothing but your personal effects. No alimony, no claim to the Sterling shipping fortune. You are entitled to at least a settlement." "She's entitled to what I give her," Marcus cut in, his eyes narrowing. "And right now, I'm giving her a choice. Sign this and walk away with your dignity, or fight me, and I will bury you in litigation until you are 40 years old and begging for spare change." Alexander looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, the result of 3 nights without sleep, but her jaw was set. She looked at Marcus, the man she had married 4 years ago, thinking he was a charming, misunderstood prince. She had been a nurse then, taking care of his ailing mother. He had swept her off her feet. But as soon as the ring was on, the mask came off. He was a narcissist, a gambler, and a cheater. She looked at the empty chair at the far end of the room. That was where Arthur Sterling, Marcus's father, and the patriarch of the empire usually sat. But Arthur had been in a coma for 6 months. With the old lion asleep, the jackal had taken over. "I don't want your money, Marcus," Alexander said, her voice quiet but steady. Marcus let out a short, barking laugh. He looked at his personal attorney, Silas Thorne. "You hear that, Silas? She doesn't want the money. A saint, a veritable saint walking among us sinners." Silas Thorne, a man with eyes like a shark, didn't smile. He just pushed the paper closer to Alexander. Alexander picked up the pen. It felt heavy. This signature meant she was walking away from a billion-dollar lifestyle. It meant going back to her studio apartment, back to double shifts at the hospital, back to worrying about the heating bill. But it also meant she would never have to smell Marcus's whiskey-soaked breath again. It meant she wouldn't have to find receipts for diamond necklaces bought for women named Jessica or Chloe. She pressed the nib to the paper. The scratching sound was loud in the silence. Alexander Marie Sterling, She put the pen down. Marcus snatched the paper immediately, scanning the signature as if he expected it to fade away. When he saw it was real, a grin spread across his face, a grin so filled with malice and triumph it made Alexander's stomach turn. "Well done," Marcus said. He stood up, buttoning his Italian silk jacket. "Security will escort you out. You have 24 hours to vacate the manor. Anything left behind becomes the property of the estate." "I've already packed," Alexander said, standing up. Her legs felt weak. Marcus walked around the table and leaned in close to her ear. "You know," he whispered, "I almost feel bad for you. You really thought you were Cinderella, didn't you? But you were just the help. And now you're nothing." He pulled back and laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a laugh of pure dominance. "Goodbye, Alexander. Don't use my last name as a reference." He turned and marched out of the room, Silas Thorne trailing behind him like a shadow. Alexander stood alone in the boardroom. The silence rushed back in. She felt a tear track down her cheek, but she angrily wiped it away. She had lost everything material, yes. But as she looked at the stormy Chicago skyline, she felt a strange, terrifying lightness in her chest. She was free. But she had no idea that her signature on that document had just triggered a sequence of events that had been set in motion years ago. She thought the story was over. In reality, the ink hadn't even dried on the first chapter. 6 months had passed since the day in the boardroom. The transition from the penthouse to the pavement had been brutal. Alexander was living in a cramped walk-up apartment in the Rogers Park neighborhood. The heating was temperamental, the neighbors were loud, and the view was a brick wall. She had returned to nursing, picking up graveyard shifts at St. Jude's Hospital. It was grueling work. Her feet ached constantly, and the dark circles under her eyes had become permanent residents. But she was surviving. She paid her own bills. She bought her own groceries. Every now and then, she would see Marcus in the tabloids or on the news in the hospital waiting room. Marcus Sterling, CEO of Sterling Shipping, seen vacationing in Monaco with model Jessica Vane. Sterling stock soar as new aggressive leadership takes hold. He looked happy, powerful, untouchable. It stung, not because she missed him, but because of the injustice of it all. He was a monster who slept on silk sheets, while she, who had nursed his dying mother and tried to save his soul, was scraping leftovers into Tupperware. It was a Tuesday morning, raining again, when the phone rang. Alexander was just coming off a 12-hour shift, her body screaming for sleep. She stared at the unknown number. "Hello? Mrs. Sterling?" A deep, gravelly voice. "It's Ms. Vance," she corrected automatically. "Who is this?" "This is Arthur Sterling's private physician, Dr. Heiress. I have some news." Alexander's heart stopped. Even during the worst of her marriage to Marcus, she had cared for Arthur. The old man was fearsome, a tycoon who had built an empire from nothing. He was cold, hard, and ruthless in business. But in the evenings, when Alexander would bring him his tea or read to him when his eyesight began to fail, she had seen a different side, a lonely side. He had never defended her against Marcus openly, which had hurt her, but he had never been cruel to her either. He was just observant, always watching. "Is he?" "He passed away an hour ago, Ms. Vance," Dr. Heiress said gently. "He woke up briefly from the coma. He asked for you. We tried to call, but he asked for me." Alexander gripped the phone. "Yes." And then he was gone. Tears welled in her eyes. "Does Marcus know?" "Mr. Sterling has been notified. He is currently unavailable. I believe he is in Aspen." Of course he was. His father dies, and Marcus is skiing. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Vance. I know you aren't family anymore. but Arthur gave specific instructions to his legal team before he went into the coma regarding his funeral. What instructions? That you are to attend. Mandatory attendance was the phrase used. Alexander frowned. I can't go there. Marcus will have me thrown out by security. You know how he is. He can't, Dr. Heiress said. The funeral is being organized by Mr. Blackwood. You remember Arthur's personal executor? Mr. Blackwood. The name sent a shiver down her spine. If Silas Thorne was a shark, Elias Blackwood was a leviathan. He was Arthur's oldest friend, and the only man Marcus was genuinely afraid of. Blackwood had retired years ago, disappearing to a private island, but apparently he was back. Mr. Blackwood has made it clear, the doctor continued. If you are not present at the funeral and the subsequent reading of the last will and testament, the proceedings cannot begin. Marcus cannot touch a penny of the inheritance until you walk into that room. Alexander sat down on her lumpy mattress. Why? I signed away my rights. I signed the release. I have no claim to the estate. I don't know the details, Miss Vance. I just know that Arthur was a man who played chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Please. The funeral is on Friday at the family estate. Alexander hung up the phone. She walked to her small, cracked mirror. She looked tired. She looked poor. She looked like exactly what Marcus said she was, a nobody. Why would Arthur want her there? To humiliate her one last time? To show her what she had lost? Or was it something else? She remembered the last conversation she had with Arthur before the coma. He was sitting in his wheelchair by the fireplace, looking frail. Marcus had just screamed at Alexander in the hallway for buying the wrong brand of scotch. Arthur had looked at her with those steel-grey eyes. Endurance, Alexander, he had rasped. It is the only currency that matters in this family. Not gold. Endurance. She hadn't understood it then. She wasn't sure she understood it now. But on Friday, she would put on her only black dress, the one she had bought at a thrift store, and she would walk back into the lion's den. She had no idea that she was walking into a trap. The only question was, who was the trap set for? The Sterling estate sat on 300 acres of prime Illinois land, a sprawling architectural beast of stone and ivy that looked less like a home and more like a fortress designed to keep the world out. Alexander arrived in a yellow taxi. The cab driver, a kind man named Stan, hesitated at the massive iron gates. You sure you got the right place, miss? This looks like... well, it looks like a castle. It is, Alexander murmured, staring up at the wrought iron crest of the Sterling family, a lion devouring a serpent. I'm sure. Thank you, Stan. She paid him and stepped out into the drizzle. The driveway was a sea of black. Black limousines, black SUVs, black umbrellas. The cars alone were worth more than the entire neighborhood she now lived in. Bentleys, Rolls-Royces, and armored Mercedes lined the gravel path like polished beetles. Alexander smoothed down her dress. It was simple, black, and modest. It was the best she could do. She clutched her old purse tight against her side, her knuckles white. She could feel the eyes on her immediately. The staff, standing like statues by the entrance, recognized her. Some looked down in pity. Others, the ones loyal to Marcus, looked at her with disdain. As she ascended the stone steps, a familiar, mocking voice cut through the sound of the rain. I didn't know we were accepting charity cases today. Alexander froze. She looked up to see Marcus standing under the portico. He looked devastatingly handsome in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, his hair perfectly coiffed. Beside him, stood a woman who looked like she had been manufactured in a laboratory for supermodels. Jessica Vane. She was wearing a black dress that was technically appropriate for a funeral, but fit so tightly it was clearly meant to advertise, not mourn. "Hello, Marcus," Alexander said, keeping her voice even. "I'm here for your father." "My father is dead," Marcus spat, his handsome face twisting into a sneer. "And you are trespassing. The divorce is final, Alexander. You aren't family. You're barely even a guest." Jessica giggled, a hollow, tinkling sound. "Is this her? The nurse?" "Oh, Marcus, you said she was plain, but you didn't say she looked so tired." "She looks poor," Marcus corrected, "because she is. Security." Two burly men in dark suits stepped forward. Alexander's heart hammered against her ribs. She was going to be thrown out, humiliated in front of half of Chicago's elite. "Escort Miss Vance off the property," Marcus commanded, waving his hand as if swatting a fly. "If she resists, call the police." The guards reached for her. Alexander took a step back, bracing herself. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that stopped the guards in their tracks. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. Every head turned. Standing in the open doorway of the manor was Elias Blackwood. He was a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 60, perhaps 80. He was tall, gaunt, and wore a suit that looked like it was cut from the shadows themselves. He leaned on a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. Elias Blackwood was not just a lawyer. He was the Sterling family's fixer from the old days. He knew where the bodies were buried because he had usually dug the holes. "Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice losing some of its bravado. "I was just handling a gatecrasher." "Ms. Vance is not a gatecrasher," Blackwood said, limping slowly down the steps. The crowd parted for him instantly. "She is a required participant in today's proceedings. In fact, under the specific bylaws of your father's directive, the funeral service cannot commence until she is seated." Marcus's face turned a violent shade of red. "This is ridiculous. She's my ex-wife. She signed the release." "The dead do not care for your paperwork, Marcus," Blackwood said coldly. He stopped in front of Alexander. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned her face. For a brief second, his expression softened. "Hello, Alexander. You look like you haven't been eating." "I'm fine, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. "Come," he said, offering her his arm. "You will sit in the front row, next to me." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. The front row was for immediate family only. By placing her there, Blackwood was elevating the discarded ex-wife to the same status as the son. Marcus looked like he was about to explode, but he swallowed his rage. He couldn't fight Blackwood. Not yet. Not until the money was transferred. "Fine," Marcus hissed. He grabbed Jessica's hand. "Let's get this over with." The service was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The grand hall of the manor had been converted into a chapel. Lilies, thousands of them, suffocated the room with their cloying scent. The pews were filled with business rivals, politicians and social climbers, all pretending to mourn a man they had feared. Alexander sat in the front row, staring at the closed mahogany casket. She didn't cry. Her grief was a quiet, heavy thing in her chest. She remembered Arthur teaching her how to play chess on rainy afternoons. She remembered him telling her that integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. She felt Marcus's eyes boring into the back of her skull. He was sitting across the aisle, checking his phone every 2 minutes. He wasn't mourning, he was waiting. He was calculating the inheritance. When the service ended, the priest announced that the immediate family and named beneficiaries were to gather in the grand library for the reading of the will. Alexander stood to leave. "I should go, Mr. Blackwood. I paid my respects." Blackwood's hand clamped onto her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "You aren't going anywhere, child. The show is just beginning." "But I have nothing to gain," she argued. "I don't want anything." "That," Blackwood said, a ghost of a smile touching his thin lips, "is exactly why you need to be there." The Grand Library was a room designed to intimidate. 2 stories of books lined the walls, accessible by spiraling brass staircases. A massive fireplace roared with flames that did little to warm the icy tension in the room. Around the long oak table sat the mourners. There was Aunt Beatrice, Arthur's sister, a woman draped in so many pearls she rattled when she moved. She had been borrowing money from Arthur for 40 years to fund her failed boutiques. There was Cousin Julian, a sweaty man in his 30s with a gambling addiction and a nervous twitch. He was currently eyeing the antique globe in the corner, as if wondering how much he could pawn it for. There was Marcus, sitting at the head of the table, sipping a glass of 25-year-old scotch, looking like a king waiting for his coronation. Jessica sat behind him, looking bored. And there was Silas Thorne, Marcus's shark lawyer, whispering in his ear. Alexander sat at the far end of the table, as far away from Marcus as possible. She felt small. Elias Blackwood stood at the front of the room. He didn't sit. He placed a heavy, leather-bound document on the table. He also placed a small remote control next to it. "Arthur Sterling was a man of precision," Blackwood began. The room fell silent. "He updated his will constantly. The version I hold in my hand was finalized 3 days before his coma began." Marcus smirked. 3 days before? Excellent. That means it predates the divorce, but since she signed the release, any mention of her is null and void. Legally, she doesn't exist. "Legally," Blackwood said, staring at Marcus over his spectacles. "You would do well to shut your mouth and listen." Marcus bristled, but stayed silent. "Arthur recorded a video message to accompany the will. He wished for you to hear his voice one last time." Blackwood pressed a button. A large screen descended from the ceiling. The projector hummed to life. Arthur Sterling appeared on the screen. He was sitting in this very library, wearing his favorite cardigan. He looked frail, oxygen tubes in his nose, but his eyes were sharp, piercingly sharp. "If you are watching this," the video Arthur wheezed, "then I finally kicked the bucket. Good. I was tired." A nervous titter ran through the room. "I have spent my life building a mountain of gold," Arthur continued, "and I have spent the last 10 years watching you all try to climb it with pickaxes, waiting for me to fall off. You are a disappointing lot. Greedy, vain, shallow." Marcus rolled his eyes. "Classic Dad. Lecture from the grave." "To my sister Beatrice," Arthur said. Beatrice straightened up, her eyes gleaming. "You have spent $4 million of my money on businesses that sell clothes no one wants. I am leaving you my collection of 19th century porcelain cats. They are hideous. I hate them. But they are worth about 50 grand if you can find a buyer. That is the last cent you will ever get from me." Beatrice's jaw dropped. "Cats? Porcelain cats? But the lake house. I was promised the lake house." "To my nephew, Julian," Arthur continued. Julian wiped sweat from his forehead. "You have a gambling problem. If I give you money, you will lose it in Vegas by Tuesday. So, I am leaving you a lifetime subscription to a financial literacy course and a trust fund that pays out exactly $2,000 a month, contingent on you passing a drug test every 30 days. Fail the test, the money stops." "2,000!" Julian cried out. "That doesn't even cover my car lease." "And now," Arthur said, leaning closer to the camera, We come to the matter of the estate, the shipping company, the properties, the investments, the billions. The room seemed to suck in a breath. Marcus leaned forward, his knuckles gripping the arms of his chair. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for his entire life. "I built this company with my bare hands," Arthur said. "I need a successor who understands the value of things, not just the price. I need someone who possesses the sterling spirit." Marcus stood up slightly, ready to accept the mantle. "Marcus, my son," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are a shark. You swim, you eat, you kill. You are good at business, yes. You tripled our stock price last year. But you are a hollow man. I watched how you treated your mother when she was dying. I watched how you treated your wife." Marcus's face hardened. "However," Arthur sighed, "blood is blood, and business is business. The bulk of the estate cannot go to strangers." Marcus exhaled, a smug grin returning. "Here it comes." Blackwood paused the video. He looked at the paper in front of him. "The specific bequests for Marcus Sterling are as follows. You inherit the Sterling Shipping CEO title permanently. You inherit the Manhattan penthouse, the Aspen Lodge, and the private jet fleet." "Yes!" Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "I knew it! The old man knew better than to cut me out." He turned to Alexander, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "You hear that? I win. CEO, the jets, everything." "Wait," Blackwood said. "I am not finished." Marcus waved a hand. "Whatever. Read the rest. What does she get? A parting gift? A toaster?" Blackwood looked at Alexander. "For Miss Alexander Vance." Alexander looked down at her hands. She just wanted to leave. "Arthur has left you. The contents of safety deposit box 404 at the First National Bank." Silence. Marcus burst out laughing. It was a loud, raucous, ugly sound. "A safety deposit box, that's it? What's in it, Alexander? His old cufflinks? A love letter? Maybe some dusty jewelry he forgot to insure?" He turned to the room, spreading his arms wide. He laughed. He actually laughed. "This is poetic justice. You walked out on me, Alexander, and now you walk away with a box of junk." Alexander felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She stood up. "Is that all, Mr. Blackwood?" "That is the extent of your specific bequest in this section," Blackwood said, his face impassive. "Then I'm leaving," Alexander said. She couldn't take the humiliation anymore. "Sit down, Alexander," Marcus mocked. "Don't you want to hear how much money I got? We haven't even gotten to the liquid assets yet, the bank accounts, the stocks." "Actually," Blackwood interrupted, his voice cutting through Marcus's, gloating like a razor wire. "We have reached a complication." Marcus frowned. "What complication?" "I got the company. I got the houses." "You got the physical assets," Blackwood corrected. "You own the buildings. You own the planes. You have the job title. So, that's the empire." "Not quite," Blackwood said. He flipped a page in the heavy document. "Arthur structured his wealth in a very specific way. The Sterling Empire is held in a blind trust. The trust owns the controlling shares of the shipping company. The trust owns the bank accounts. The trust pays the operating costs for the jets and the taxes on the mansions." "Okay," Marcus said slowly. "So I control the trust. I'm the CEO." "No," Blackwood said. "You are not the trustee." The room went dead silent. "Who is?" Silas Thorne asked sharply, sensing a disaster. Blackwood looked at the video screen. He pressed play. Arthur's face returned. He was smiling now, a mischievous, dangerous smile. "Marcus, you always loved toys, so I gave you the toys. The planes, the houses. But toys are expensive to maintain. And you spend money like water. You need an allowance. What is he talking about? Marcus whispered, his face losing color. Therefore, Arthur said, I have appointed a sole beneficiary of the Sterling Master Trust. This person holds the purse strings. This person decides if the company expands or contracts. This person signs the checks that pay for the fuel in your jet and the electricity in your penthouse. If they decide to cut you off, Marcus, you will be a king living in a castle with no lights and no food. Who is it? Marcus screamed at the screen. Who controls the money? Arthur leaned back in his chair in the video. I needed someone who understands the value of $1. Someone who knows what it's like to have nothing, so they will respect having everything. I needed someone with a heart to balance your ruthlessness. The sole beneficiary of the Sterling Master Trust is Alexander Vance. The silence that followed was louder than an explosion. Marcus turned slowly to look at Alexander. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Alexander sat frozen. She couldn't breathe. What? She whispered. It's a mistake, Marcus stammered. It's a joke. It has to be. It is no joke, Blackwood said, closing the folder with a heavy thud. Alexander Vance controls 90% of the Sterling fortune, roughly $4 billion. But she signed the release, Silas Thorne shouted, jumping up. The post-nuptial release. She waived all rights to the Sterling assets. Ah, Blackwood said. I was waiting for that. He pulled a single thin piece of paper from his pocket. The release Alexander signed, Blackwood said, his eyes glittering, waived her rights to marital assets, assets shared between husband and wife. But the Sterling Master Trust was never Marcus's money. It was Arthur's. It is a third-party inheritance. The divorce settlement has no jurisdiction over a gift from a father to a friend. Blackwood turned to Alexander, who was shaking. Congratulations, Miss Vance, Blackwood said. You are now the boss of your ex-husband, and you own the mortgage on the house he is currently standing in. Marcus looked at Alexander. The arrogance was gone. The cruelty was gone, replaced by a sheer, primal panic. He had laughed when she signed the paper. He wasn't laughing now. The silence in the grand library didn't break. It shattered. This is fraud, Silas Thorne was screaming, his shark-like composure gone. He was throwing papers onto the oak table. Undue influence. Mental incompetence. We will contest this until the end of time. Marcus stood frozen. He looked at Alexander, his eyes wide, searching for some sign that she would fix this, that she was still the submissive, quiet nurse he had married. Alexander, he choked out, his voice trembling. Alexander, you know this is insane. You don't know how to run a multinational conglomerate. You're a nurse. Alexander looked at him. For the first time in years, she didn't see a powerful tycoon. She saw a panicked child who had just had his favorite toy snatched away. I might be a nurse, Marcus, she said softly, her voice gaining strength. But I know how to stop a bleeding wound. And right now this family is bleeding. I am the CEO, Marcus roared, regaining his fury. I run the company. You can't touch operations. True, Elias Blackwood interjected, his voice calm and dry like old parchment. Marcus runs the operations, but Alexander approves the budget. If Marcus wants to buy a new ship, he asks Alexander. If Marcus wants to pay his salary, he asks Alexander. If Marcus wants to fuel up the jet to go to Aspen, well, I suggest he asks Alexander nicely. The reality of the situation washed over Marcus. He looked at Jessica Vane. The model was scrolling through her phone, looking annoyed. She leaned over to Marcus. So, does this mean we can't go to St. Bart's next week? Shut up, Jessica, Marcus snapped. Alexander turned to Blackwood. I want to leave, now. Of course, Blackwood said. We have one more stop, the bank. As Alexander walked toward the heavy oak doors, Marcus lunged forward. "Alexander, wait! We can work this out! We can annul the divorce! I was angry, I didn't mean it!" She stopped. She turned slowly. "You didn't mean it when you laughed at me? When you told me I was nothing?" "I was stressed," Marcus pleaded, sweating. "Baby, please. We were a team once." Alexander looked at him with eyes as cold as the Chicago winter. "We were never a team, Marcus. You were the master, and I was the pet. But the leash is in my hand now." She walked out, leaving him standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The safety deposit box. An hour later, Alexander sat in the vault of the First National Bank. The air smelled of dust and old money. Blackwood placed a long metal box on the table, box 404. "Why 404? Alexander asked, her hands shaking as she held the key Arthur had left her. "Arthur had a sense of humor," Blackwood said. "In computer code, 404 means not found. It was his way of saying that what is inside this box is what Marcus could never find. The truth." Alexander turned the key. The lock clicked. She lifted the lid. Inside, there were no diamonds, no gold bars. There was a stack of leather-bound journals and a single thick manila envelope labeled Protocol Omega. "What is this?" she whispered. "Arthur kept journals since he was 20, Blackwood explained. He wrote down everything. Every deal, every bribe, every secret. But that envelope, that is the weapon." Alexander opened the envelope. Inside were bank statements, not from the Sterling Trust, but from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, accounts under the name MS Holdings. She scanned the documents. Her eyes widened. "These dates, these are from 3 years ago, when the company pension fund took a hit." "Correct," Blackwood said darkly. "Marcus didn't just spend too much money, Alexander. He stole it. He siphoned $40 million from the employee pension fund to cover his gambling debts in Macau. Arthur found out just before the coma. He was planning to turn Marcus in to the SEC. Alexander felt sick. He stole from the workers? From the people on the docks? Yes. Arthur couldn't do it before the stroke took him. So he left the evidence to you." Blackwood leaned in. "This is why you are the sole beneficiary. You have the power to cut off his money, but you also have the power to send him to federal prison. The choice is yours." Alexander stared at the papers. She had thought this was about money. It wasn't. It was about justice. Marcus wasn't just a bad husband. He was a criminal. She closed the box. Her hands stopped shaking. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steel. "Take me to the Sterling Tower. I have a meeting to call." The following Monday, the atmosphere at Sterling Tower was electric. Rumors had spread like wildfire. The staff knew something had happened at the funeral, but no one knew the specifics. All they knew was that Marcus Sterling had stormed into the building at 8 a.m. screaming at his assistants. At 9 a.m., Marcus tried to buy a coffee at the robotic barista in the lobby. He tapped his black card. Declined. He frowned and tapped it again. Declined. He pulled out his corporate platinum card. Declined. Contact administrator. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered. He looked around. People were watching. He shoved the cards into his pocket and marched to the elevator. When he reached the executive floor, he found the hallway crowded. Board members, department heads, and legal teams were gathered outside the main conference room. "What is going on?" Marcus demanded, pushing through the crowd. "Why is everyone standing here?" Silas Thorne hurried over, looking pale. "Marcus, we have a problem. A big one. Fix it, Silas, and tell me why my credit cards are frozen." "That's related to the problem," Silas whispered. "She's here." "Who?" "Alexander." Marcus stopped. He stared at the double doors of the boardroom. He kicked them open. Alexander was sitting at the head of the table, his chair. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, sharp and professional. Her hair was pulled back. She didn't look like the woman who had cried over a divorce paper. She looked like the CEO she was born to be. Elias Blackwood stood behind her right shoulder. "Get out of my chair," Marcus snarled, marching toward her. Alexander didn't blink. She pressed a button on the intercom. "Security, please stand by outside the boardroom. We have a disruptive employee." "Employee?" Marcus shouted. "I am the owner." "Actually," Alexander said calmly, opening a folder in front of her, "you are the CEO, which makes you an employee of the trust. And as the trustee, I have some concerns about your performance." The board of directors, sitting around the table, watched in stunned silence. They had always feared Marcus, but they worshipped money, and they knew where the money was now. "I am suing you," Marcus yelled, slamming his hands on the table. "Silas has already filed the papers. You can't freeze my personal accounts." "I didn't freeze your personal accounts," Alexander said, looking at a spreadsheet. "I froze the company accounts that you've been using as personal ones. The jet fuel? Cancelled. The lease on the penthouse? Suspended pending audit. The corporate card you used to buy jewelry for Miss Vane? Revoked." Marcus's face turned purple. "You can't do that. I have an image to maintain. The stock price relies on my confidence." "The stock price relies on the company not being looted," Alexander retorted. She stood up. She wasn't tall, but in that moment, she towered over him. "We have a choice, Marcus," she said to the room. "We can continue with business as usual, where the CEO treats the company treasury like a piggy bank, or we can restructure." "You can't fire me," Marcus sneered. "The bylaws say the CEO can only be removed by a unanimous vote of the board, and I own half the board." He looked at the men around the table, cronies he had bribed with lavish trips. "Right, boys?" Two of the board members nodded nervously. Marcus smiled. "See? Checkmate, honey. You control the money, but I control the power. If you don't unfreeze my assets, I will tank this company. I will drive it into the ground. I'll fire thousands. I'll ruin the legacy. Do you have the stomach for that, Alexander?" It was a standoff. Marcus was holding the company hostage. He was willing to burn his father's empire to the ground, just to spite her. Alexander looked at Blackwood. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "I expected you to say that," Alexander said. "You're right, Marcus. I can't fire you without the board, and I don't want to burn the company down." She reached into her bag and pulled out the manila envelope from box 404. She slid it across the table. It stopped inches from Marcus's hand. "What is this?" he asked, suspicious. "Just some reading material," Alexander said. "Page 3 is my favorite. It details the wire transfer from the pension fund to the Golden Dragon Casino in Macau, dated November 12, 2022. The color drained from Marcus's face so fast he looked like a corpse. That's a lie," he whispered. "Is it?" Alexander asked. "Because the FBI forensic accountants I hired this morning don't seem to think so. They're currently in the lobby, waiting for my signal." The board members gasped. The cronies who had supported Marcus moments ago suddenly scooted their chairs away from him. "You wouldn't," Marcus hissed. "I'm your husband. I was your husband." "You told me I was nothing," Alexander said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "You laughed when I signed away my life. You wanted me to have nothing? Fine, I will leave you with nothing." She looked at the board. Gentlemen, I am calling for a vote of no confidence in the CEO. If he is removed immediately, I will refrain from handing this envelope to the authorities. For now, we will handle this internally. If he stays, the FBI comes up in 5 minutes. She looked at Marcus. Your choice. Resign or go to prison. Marcus looked at the envelope. He looked at the door. He looked at Silas Thorne, who was busy pretending to read a blank piece of paper to avoid eye contact. Marcus realized with a sickening thud in his stomach that the game was over. The nurse hadn't just beaten him, she had dissected him. Fine, Marcus spat. I quit. Good, Alexander said. Security will escort you out. And Marcus. He paused at the door, broken and defeated. Leave the watch, she said. It was a company expense. Marcus slowly unclasped the Rolex Daytona, the symbol of his status, and dropped it on the table. He walked out of the room, a king without a crown, into a hallway of whispering employees who were already cheering for the new queen. Alexander sat back down. Her legs were shaking under the table. She took a deep breath. Mr. Blackwood, she said, we have work to do. Indeed we do, Madam Chairwoman. Blackwood smiled. Indeed we do. The cleanup was harder than the takeover. 3 months after Marcus was escorted out of the Sterling Tower, Alexander Vance sat in the corner office on the 45th floor. The room had changed. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes that Marcus loved were gone, replaced by sheer linen that let the Chicago sunlight flood the room. The smell of stale whiskey and expensive cigars had been scrubbed away, replaced by the scent of fresh coffee and lemon polish. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of concentration. Alexander rubbed her temples. On her desk sat 3 mountains of paperwork. Marcus hadn't just embezzled money. He had rotted the company from the inside out. There were shell companies to dissolve, toxic assets to liquidate, and trust to be rebuilt with the 3,000 employees whose pensions she had saved. You look like you're carrying the world, Alexander, a voice said from the doorway. It was Elias Blackwood. The old lawyer still visited every Tuesday, acting as her advisor, her shield, and increasingly the grandfather figure she had never had. I'm just trying not to drop it, Elias, Alexander sighed, leaning back in the executive chair that still felt a little too big for her. The board is pushing back on the hospital wing donation. They say it's bad for quarterly dividends. Tell them that dividends are for shareholders, but legacies are for history, Blackwood said, walking in and placing a small, velvet box on her desk. And remind them who signs their bonus checks. Alexander smiled. She had learned fast. I already did. I told them if they didn't like it, they could resign and join Marcus in the unemployment line. Blackwood chuckled. Arthur would have loved that. You have his grit, Alexander. You just needed the fire to temper it. Speaking of Marcus, Alexander's smile faded. Have we heard anything? He's in litigation, Blackwood said, his face hardening. He's trying to sue for emotional distress. It won't go anywhere. He's running out of money. Jessica Vane left him 2 days after the resignation. Apparently, her love for him was directly tied to his credit limit. I don't want to destroy him, Elias, Alexander said softly. I just wanted him to stop. He destroyed himself, child. You just turned on the lights. Blackwood tapped the velvet box on the desk. Open it. It was found in Arthur's private safe at the manor. It was marked for you, to be opened 1 year after his death. But I think you've earned it early. Alexander opened the box. Inside lay a simple silver locket. It wasn't flashy or encrusted with diamonds. It was old, tarnished silver. It belonged to Arthur's mother, Blackwood explained. She was a washerwoman. She scrubbed floors so Arthur could go to school. He kept it to remind him where he came from. He wanted you to have it. Alexander opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, folded piece of paper with Arthur's shaky handwriting. The wolf eats the sheep. The lion eats the wolf, but the shepherd protects the flock. Be the shepherd, Alexander. Tears pricked her eyes. She clasped the locket around her neck. It felt heavy, cold, and right. That evening, Alexander asked her driver to take a detour on the way home to the Sterling Manor. She rarely stayed at the massive estate, preferring a modest townhouse closer to the city, but she needed to check on the renovations. As the black SUV pulled up to the wrought iron gates, the headlights caught a figure standing in the rain. The figure was huddled in a trench coat that had seen better days. He was shaking the gate, shouting something that the wind tore away. "Stop the car," Alexander said. "Miss Vance, I don't think that's safe." Her driver, a former Marine named Davis, said. "It's fine, Davis. I know him." Alexander lowered the window. The cold rain lashed against her face. "Marcus?" The man turned. It was Marcus Sterling, but he was a ghost of the man who had sat at the head of the boardroom table. His hair was disheveled, his face unshaven, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked thinner, hollowed out by rage and humiliation. "You," Marcus snarled, rushing toward the car. Davis immediately stepped out, blocking him, hand hovering near his holster. Marcus stopped, panting. "You stole my life!" Marcus screamed, rain dripping off his nose. "This is my house. That's my car. You were nothing. You scrubbed the floors." "I took care of your father," Alexander said, her voice calm, projecting over the sound of the storm. "I took care of you, and you laughed at me." "I want a settlement," Marcus shouted. "I'll go to the press. I'll tell them you manipulated a dying man." "Go ahead," Alexander said. "Tell them, and I'll show them the wire transfers to Macau. I'll show them the emails where you called your own father a senile old cash cow." "Do you really want to play that game, Marcus?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. The fight drained out of him. He slumped against the cold iron bars of the gate. He looked small. "I have nothing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They took the condo. They took the cars. I'm staying on Julian's couch." Alexander looked at him. She felt a flash of the old instinct, the nurse's instinct to heal, to fix, to comfort. She wanted to write him a check. She wanted to help. But then she remembered the pen tapping on the table. She remembered the laugh. She remembered the cruelty that wasn't a mistake, but a choice he made every single day. "You have your health, Marcus," Alexander said, "and you have a business degree. You can get a job. You can start over, like I did." "A job?" Marcus scoffed, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "I'm a Sterling. I don't work." Alexander signaled Davis to get back in the car. "That," Alexander said as the window rolled up, "is exactly why you aren't a Sterling anymore." The car glided through the gates, leaving Marcus standing in the rain, staring at the empire he had been born to rule, but was too weak to keep. The final twist of the story didn't happen in a boardroom or a bank vault. It happened 6 months later, at the opening of the Arthur Sterling Medical Center. It was a black tie gala. Alexander wore a gown of midnight blue, the silver locket resting against her throat. She was surrounded by cameras, donors, and doctors. She was the woman of the hour, the Cinderella CEO, the press called her. She stepped up to the podium to give her speech. The flashbulbs blinded her for a moment. "My late father-in-law," she began, her voice steady, "believed that wealth was a test. It tests your character. It tests your soul. He failed that test many times before he passed it. I intend to pass it every day." The crowd applauded. As she stepped down, Elias Blackwood approached her. He looked grave. "Alexander, there's someone you need to meet." In the private lounge. Alexander frowned. "Can it wait?" "I have to greet the mayor." "No, it cannot wait." She followed him into the quiet VIP room. Standing by the fireplace was a young woman. She was perhaps 20 years old, dressed in a simple, inexpensive dress. She looked terrified. She was holding a baby. "Alexander," Blackwood said. "This is Clara." "Hello, Clara," Alexander said gently. "How can I help you?" Clara looked up. Her eyes were a piercing, familiar steel grey, the exact shade of Arthur Sterling's eyes. I didn't want to come," Clara stammered. "But my mum died last year. She told me who my father was." Alexander looked at Blackwood. He nodded slowly. "Arthur?" Alexander whispered. "He had a relationship 21 years ago," Blackwood said, "with a woman in the accounting department. He paid her off. He sent her away. He never knew about the child." Alexander looked at the girl. She was the spitting image of the man who had given Alexander everything. "I don't want money," Clara said quickly, clutching the baby tighter. I saw you on the news. You seemed kind. I just wanted to know what he was like." Alexander's mind raced. This girl was a legitimate heir. If this went to court, it could tear the trust apart. It could freeze the assets again. It could destroy everything Alexander had built. Silas Thorne would have a field day with this. The smart business move, the Marcus move, would be to call security, deny everything, and bury her in legal fees. Alexander looked at the terrified girl. She looked at the baby. She remembered the locket. Be the shepherd. Alexander walked over to Clara. She didn't call security. She didn't call a lawyer. She extended her hand. "He was complicated," Alexander said, smiling through tears. "He was brilliant, and he was flawed, and he would have been very proud to meet you." Alexander turned to Blackwood. "Elias, get the car. Clara and the baby are staying at the manor tonight." "Alexander," Blackwood warned softly, "legally this is dangerous." "I don't care about the law, Elias," Alexander said, linking her arm through Clara's. "I care about the family, the real family." As they walked out of the gala, leaving the cameras and the glitter behind, Alexander realized that the curse of the Sterlings, the greed, the infighting, the loneliness, had finally been broken. Marcus had laughed when she signed away the money, but Alexander smiled as she shared it. And that was the only victory that mattered. And that is the story of Alexander Vance. She went from a disregarded wife, mocked by the man who vowed to love her, to the most powerful woman in the city. Marcus thought power came from a bank account, from a last name, and from fear. But Arthur Sterling knew better in the end. He knew that real power comes from endurance. It comes from the ability to hold your head up when people are laughing at you, and the grace to offer a hand when those same people are down. It's a brutal lesson, isn't it? Marcus had everything and ended up with nothing because he loved things and used people. Alexander had nothing and ended up with everything because she loved people and used things to help them. So, here is the question for you guys today. If you were in Alexander's shoes and you saw Marcus standing at that gate in the rain, begging for help, would you have given him a second chance? Or did he get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of karma, revenge, and justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow so I can bring you more stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you never miss the next twist. Thanks for watching, listening, and remember, be careful who you laugh at on the way up, because you might meet them on the way down.